I don't know if you've been paying attention, but in recent years, the state of global politics has been pretty bleak. But don't worry, the free market is here to save us.
Shell's annual profit announced today a UK record-breaking £32.2 billion. They've not paid any tax in the UK since 2017.
And if you are paying attention, it's pretty hard not to be angry. Climate change, poverty, the resurgence of fascism, the inexplicable popularity of Joe Rogan, all of these cause confusion, maybe rage, and maybe even despair. I think this might be in part why the climate movement has historically had trouble getting people on board. You know, they say we need systemic change or all of this will end, and I think people hear that and subconsciously think, well, so what? This isn't so great. Why not burn it to the ground and start all over? The prospect of preserving this might not be enough to inspire people. It's happened before. A 2016 documentary by Guerra called Voices from the North examined the reasons why people in a small northern town in England voted Leave in the Brexit referendum. Now, as you might expect if you are a thinking sort of person, there are a myriad and often conflicting reasons why people voted Leave in the 2016 Brexit referendum. Might have been fears over immigration, promises, over increased funding for the NHS, fears of an overreaching foreign entity, the European Union. But also, a lot of people voted Leave purely as a way of sticking it to Conservative governments who had for decades underfunded towns exactly like this one.
I'm from the Midlands, I'm from Birmingham, so we've seen industry hit come and go there as well.
Yeah.
And what's happened, so there's no future for the youngsters at all.
Do you think that's influenced the vote for out? I do.
Definitely.
And it's important to note that since the 1980s, Britain has had exclusively Conservative governments. Not all of these were a part of the Conservative Party, but all of them had Conservative ideologies because the Overton window in Britain is about a centimetre wide and getting increasingly narrower. Thank you, Mr. Starmer. And political pessimism doesn't only lead to apathy or a kind of rebellious reactionism, it can lead to something much worse. You might think that this kind of climate doomerism is justified, that the world is filled with selfish people who will just pollute. But the problem with reducing this issue to human nature is twofold. First of all of society, all of this, by that I don't mean my parents' basement, I mean the general sort of project of civilization. The aim of this has been to distance ourselves from nature, make it a bit easier for us to coexist in the harsh conditions of reality. And secondly, if the problem is humans, you eventually reach the point where the problem is too many humans, and we need to reduce the number of humans in order to make climate progress. This is a long-standing idea that goes back to Thomas Malthus and his essay on the principles of population, which was published in 1798. In it, Malthus argued that increases in food production were a double-edged sword, because increases in food production led not to an improved living standard for the general population, but to an increased population who subsisted on the same meagre rations as before. Malthus argued that the human population expanded greatly in times of plenty, which would lead to famine and inevitably war during times of scarcity. That the increase in human population would eventually and inevitably lead to a disastrous rapid collapse. As such, Malthus recommended both positive and negative forms of population control. The negative forms involved birth control and celibacy, whereas the positive forms involved famine, war, and disease. Malthus also commented that the second checks had already begun, but were confined chiefly, though not solely perhaps, to the lowest orders of society. Malthus was hugely influential, especially in the development of eugenics. In fact, in 1927, the Supreme Court of the USA ruled in favor of the forced sterilization of undesirable citizens, a decision that was greatly inspired by Malthus's writing. And it's this same logic that leads to eco-fascism, which is kind of a greenwashing of the far right. In fact, in 2021, Mark Brnovich, who was then the Attorney General of the American state of Arizona, filed a lawsuit against Biden's immigration policies, alleging that migrants, like everyone else, need housing, infrastructure, hospitals, and schools. They drive cars, purchase goods, and use public parks and other facilities. Their actions also directly result in the release of pollutants, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which directly affects air quality. But people aren't the problem. The problem is that we've created an economic system which prioritizes the accumulation of capital over just about everything else. And it doesn't matter how much environmental degradation, how much violence, or how much exploitation is needed to happen in order to maximize that accumulation of capital. So a depressing and nihilistic imagination of the future is not only not particularly useful, it might be ushering in the exact kind of future which we hope to avoid. Perhaps we need to imagine something a little bit more interesting. Enter Solarpunk. And don't worry about the change in lighting, change in positioning, whatever. I'm in a basement. It's a whole thing. Don't worry about it. Solarpunk is a way to imagine an alternative reality. And imagining alternative realities is a political act. But in order to understand how this all fits together, we first need to look at what solarpunk is. And to understand that, we need to understand where it comes from. Solarpunk is an aesthetic and literary movement that emerged as a response to other aesthetic and literary movements, specifically cyberpunk and steampunk. Now, you might assume, as I did, that cyberpunk derived from steampunk, but it's actually the other way around. Cyberpunk is a genre of dystopian fiction which focuses on a high-tech, low-life aesthetic. Some of the early works written in this style include Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was later adapted as Blade Runner. The genre rose to even greater prominence in 2020 with the release of the video game Cyberpunk 2077. If you're not a video game person, you may remember it from the trailer, which had a pretty badass Keanu Reeves telling you that you've got to burn down a city.
Wake the fuck up, samurai. We have a city to burn.
The term steampunk was coined in 1987 to describe the novels of Tim Powers, James Blaylock, and K.W. Jeter. Steampunk imagines a high-tech and futuristic society that takes its aesthetics from the 19th century. But rather than electricity powering this halcyon future, it's steam. Think brass, steam, hot air balloons, and daring romance a la Jules Verne. It often involves a lot of cynicism towards capitalism and antiquated Victorian values. Steampunk has become very popular, in large part due to its aesthetics. Lots of brass and clockwork, it's all very sexy, and it's a great alternative fantasy setting. Circuit boards somehow don't seem magical, and steampunk offers an alternative means to our high-tech modernity. Such is its appeal as a setting for fantasy that I have seen not one, but two steampunk adaptations of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Solarpunk is very explicitly opposed to steampunk. The essay which coined the term was published in 2008 by John Roberts on the charmingly titled blog The Republic of Bees. The idea for solarpunk was inspired by the launch of the Beluga Sky Sail, a hybrid cargo ship which uses a sail. In opposition to cyberpunk, solarpunk is high-tech, high-life. It becomes easier to understand these three subgenres, as well as any other literary genre with punk affixed to it, if we consider what we mean by punk. Punk implies subversion. Punk works of art, be they cyber, steam, solar, or otherwise, have something critical to say about the current state of affairs. Cyberpunk does so in a pessimistic, dystopian way. This is how it is, this is where it's going, and we're all doomed. But solarpunk does so in an optimistic, utopian way. This is how it is, and this is how it could be, and isn't that wonderful? As with any noun, the meaning of solarpunk is negotiated and in flux. But to understand the core of solarpunk, we can look at a definition from Sunbeam City, a website that is self-described as a solarpunk collective. I have to stop doing this, I'm doing far too many of these. Solarpunks cherish nature, progress, and science, the individual and the community. They believe in a world that is green, colourful, and bright. It can be described as a literary genre, an aesthetic, or a movement. The key points are an emphasis on renewable energy, especially solar power, a demand for technology in society to recenter around sustainability, longevity, and balance, a focus on decentralization, community activism, social justice, and civic empowerment, a recognition that economic, social, and ecological injustices are all deeply interconnected. So, solarpunk is an artistic movement, but it's also a blueprint for utopia. And given that it imagines a mode of living that is high-tech, inherently anti-capitalist, environmentally harmonious, and aesthetically beautiful, solarpunk represents a very appealing political philosophy. And actually, it was sort of always intended to be so. In Robert's original essay, he writes, "Obviously, a major difference between solarpunk and steampunk is that solarpunk writings and solarpunk technologies need not be imaginary, and I have some hope of eventually living in a solarpunk world." The term utopian is sometimes used to describe an idea which is not practical, but actually, we have a deep need for utopias. In The Conversation, Dr. Jennifer Hamilton, a postdoc at the University of Sydney, said, "Solarpunks resist the present by imagining a future that requires radical societal change. Radical, perhaps, but not radically impossible." You know, it's a real tragedy, but the last mainstream utopian media that we had was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and that was published in 1989. Well, that is, if you don't count the summer of Pokemon Go in 2016, but to be honest, I think that was more incidental than anything else. Brief aside, everything else in this video I have a key source for, but I don't actually remember where I heard that about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I'm pretty sure it was on an episode of Factually with Anna Conover, but I can't find the specific one that it was, so if you know, please let me know. A part of the left's reluctance to engage in utopian ideals is the fault of the big daddies of socialism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They were materialists, and they believed that society couldn't be changed by appealing to ideals, only by changing the material conditions of economies. And in a sense, this is true. You can't change deeply entrenched economic systems by appealing to the morality of those who are oppressing you. Marx and Engels weren't actually very prescriptive. They didn't sketch out a vision for the future. They merely pointed out that capitalism was kind of fucked. So in editing that, I thought I might need to explain a little bit about what I meant in saying Marx was not a utopian. Marx and Engels called what they did scientific socialism. That is, they sort of analysed the world in terms of a series of economic relationships, the relationship between labour and capital specifically. There was another group of socialists called utopian socialists who envisioned sort of these egalitarian communities, but they didn't use the same framework of class struggle and economic relations that Marx and Engels did. Marx and Engels didn't really describe how to get to the society that we would like, nor did they describe what that might look like beyond the sort of intricacies of economic and political relationships. People have taken Marxist ideas and used that to create utopian frameworks, but that wasn't really something that Marx and Engels themselves were all about. But the thing is, we do need something to aim for. In 2009, Mark Fisher wrote a book called Capitalist Realism. It argues that capitalism, especially the technocratic neoliberal capitalism that we have today, has so effectively entrenched itself that it doesn't present itself as mere political ideology. It presents itself as fact, backed by the science of economics. Capitalist realism imposes upon us a prison of the imagination. To break free from this prison, we must understand that other worlds are possible. We must imagine these worlds into being. This isn't to say that we should decide on a perfect model of the future. Once we have that, the future becomes a fixed object, any deviation from which can result in oppression and destruction. Utopia should represent a kind of messy negotiation, where many worlds can coexist, where many people can coexist, an active negotiation towards a future that is sketched on recycled paper rather than carved onto quarried granite. I think one of the best ways to explain this is an analogy that helped me out when I was at university and I was trying to explain the different merits of phenomenology and materialism. The difference is this. If you want to plot a course across a landscape, then you need to understand how the ground is laid out, what the elevation is, where the obstacles are. You need to understand the material conditions. You need a map. If you want to understand what it's like to go there, what the phenomenon of being there is like, then you need a painting, or a poem, or a good story. The same is true of Marx's scientific socialism and solarpunk. The same is true of Marx's scientific socialism and solarpunk. Theory helps us to understand the social, political, and economic drivers of the conditions we're in, and how to dismantle them. Solarpunk, and utopias like them, help us to imagine what the world might be like when we get there. So solarpunk presents a pretty powerful statement of political imagination, and one of the ways to begin imagining those other possibilities is to consume solarpunk media. After all, It started, and continues to be, an artistic and literary movement. In his foundational essay, John Roberts tentatively suggested Norman Spinrad's 1980 novel Songs from the Stars as a piece of solarpunk literature. But many people consider the first solarpunk novel to be Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, published in 1984. I do have a copy, but I read it as a PDF, so look, this is it, huh? This is it. The Dispossessed tells the story of Shevek, a scientist from a world called Anares. Anares is the moon of a planet called Uras, and the societies of these two different worlds couldn't be more different. Anares is a world of scarcity. It's an anarchist society built on the principles of mutual aid and cooperation. No one can be compelled to work, and the work that people do is of their own interests. All are fed unconditionally, and all are housed unconditionally. In times of hardship, they may be seconded to work in a food-growing region, otherwise their time is their own. Indeed, the only compelling force on Anares is the strong social pressure not to take more than your share, and to share the burden of infrastructural labour. Uras, on the other hand, is a world of proletarians. It's controlled mainly by two powerful states, Arlo and Thu. It's abundant in resources, and yet it's a world of haves and have-nots. It's a world where people are alienated from their labour, where conflict looms, and where Shevek, an esteemed scientist, is lavished with gifts and luxury, but who is effectively a prisoner in the ivory tower of the university where he is compelled to work. Now, importantly, Anares, the solarpunk world imagined by Le Guin, is not perfect. It's not perfect because people aren't perfect. Indeed, the subtitle of the novel is An Ambiguous Utopia. And it is ambiguous. Life on Anares is hard. It's a desert landscape where finding enough food to eat can really be a struggle. It requires mutual aid, and it requires cooperation in order to function. But importantly, despite being a work of powerful political imagination, The Dispossessed is not particularly idealistic. At one point in the book, Shevek is challenged on this. He's out to lunch with a man named Chifoilisk. Whilst dining, Chifoilisk says to Shevek, "How can you understand your situation here in a capitalist economy, a plutocratic oligarchic state? How can you see it coming from your little commune of starving idealists up in the sky?" Chifoilisk, there aren't many idealists left on Anaris, I assure you. The settlers were idealists, yes, to leave this world for our deserts, but that was 7 generations ago. Our society is practical, maybe too practical, too much concerned with survival only. What is idealistic about social cooperation, mutual aid, when it's the only means of staying alive? Chifoilisk is a representative of the state of Thu, which operates on a different governance structure than Arlo. The distinction between Arlo and Thu is similar to the distinction between the United States and the Soviet Union. Arlo is fiercely capitalist, whereas Thu has a form of centralized communism. Chifoilisk even appeals to Shevek that, "I am a socialist, like you." But Thu is still based on the centralization of power. It's a command economy rather than one based on mutual aid. The means of production are not owned by workers, they're owned by the state. The state claims to represent the workers, but without an effective democratic process, there's no parallel to ownership there. Anarchism is about the bottom-up organization of power, rather than top-down. On Anaris, it is facilitated by the high-tech DivLav system, which allocates work according to need. Life isn't always easy on Anaris, but the people are free, fed, and live within ecological boundaries. They have to. A recent mainstream depiction of a solarpunk future is an advert from Chobani, published in 2021, called Dear Alice. Actually, the version published as an advert for Chobani was called Eat Today, Feed Tomorrow, but the advert is a condensed version of Dear Alice, which was created by a marketing firm called The Line, for the use in the Chobani ad. The advert features a beautiful Studio Ghibli-style animation of a farm and a green utopian city. The narration is a grandmother writing a letter to her granddaughter about the importance of looking after people and the planet. It's a beautiful depiction, but it raises an interesting question. Should we be worried about corporations affecting a solarpunk aesthetic? The answer is, yeah, probably. The solarpunk is necessarily anti-capitalist. As Reddit user Krizsiwu said, solarpunk without abolishing capitalism is just greenwashed cyberpunk. That said, we can resist this by foregrounding solarpunk media created by independent and decentralized sources. For example, there's now a solarpunk video game being created through Kickstarter, and the more solarpunk media created, especially by those outside of the global north, the better. I've created a link in the description to a few sources of solarpunk media that you might be interested in. It's all very well to imagine a future, but eventually we actually have to bring it about. We have to take action to bring about the future that we deserve. There are other creators who have talked about this much better than I can. If you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend Andrewism's video on the topic. And sure, you can try and purchase your goods from ethical companies, you can give up flying, but the impact we have as individual consumers is very limited. The problem with voting with your dollars is that those with more dollars get more votes. And that's not very punk. But solar punk is punk. Political lobbying, voting, campaigning is all very well and important, but the results from these take time. And why wait? You have an initiative, do it yourself. No need to ask for permission. The city, the world around us, it belongs to us. And we need to assert our right to that city, our right to that world. Chances are, there are already some initiatives in your area which you can get involved in, and I would encourage you to get involved in existing initiatives before trying to start your own. Radical movements are built on solidarity and cooperation, and not foregrounding yourself is a great way to build this solidarity. We're up against some pretty powerful forces, and while we won't be able to make a dent by ourselves, together we can be something mighty. Here are some things which, if you ask me, are pretty solar punk. Each of these are worthy of their own video, and countless videos of them exists, so I'm just going to give a 15-second introduction to each of them. Guerrilla gardening involves planting plants in cities, in urban areas, without asking permission. Just go to a patch of dirt that's not being used for anything, start a garden. Bonus points if it's a food garden that can feed the people around you. Ron Finley, the gangster gardener, has some amazing resources out there about this. He even has a class on masterclass. He was very useful for my master's dissertation. He is, of course, in the description below. Mutual aid networks are organisations based in local communities which try to help people with what they need. A lot of these sprung up in the wake of COVID-19 to try and help people who may be especially vulnerable to access things like food and medicine by having people deliver them directly to their door. They're a great way to immediately feel connected to the community you're in and see the immediate, tangible benefits of your labour. They can be rather galvanising. We all know we should try and repair our clothes rather than throw them away, but the tendency is to try and make the repairs invisible. I think visible repair can add a lot of character and identity to an otherwise ordinary piece. It's the same concept as is behind kintsugi, the traditional Japanese process of repairing damaged ceramics with gold. The solarpunk scene made an interesting video about the potential of solarpunk fashion, talking about influences from Art Nouveau and local contexts, and this is great, but I think upcycled clothing, making do with the resources we have, is very punk. For example, I have this cheap leather jacket that had a tear in it, and I've put this flower patch on it. Right there, where the tear was. I think it looks pretty cool. Thanks, Mom, for sewing this for me. Join a union. Fight for better working conditions. Maybe it seems like an old-fashioned tactic, but increased democratic control over your workplace is key for ensuring better working conditions. And better working conditions, if nothing else, mean you have more time and energy for more solarpunk projects. Unions are a way of resisting capitalism, and it's capitalism, particularly the fossil form of it, that's led us to the situation we're in today. Upcycling, which I teased with the visible mending thing. Rather than recycle something, turn it into something with more utility. I think this is particularly interesting with old electronics, which can create ludicrous amounts of e-waste. I saw this recommendation of turning an old iPhone into a security camera, but I think it would be cool to focus this on a garden and have it capture an image every day. See how the nature around you changes over the course of a year. Finally, I want to suggest creating a community tool library. You know, a power drill is used for an average of 13 minutes over the course of its lifetime. This is probably apocryphal, but it's a good story. If you have tools, why not create a spreadsheet of the tools you have available and post a link to it on a neighbourhood Facebook group or the neighbour app or whatever, encouraging others to add tools that they're willing to lend out to that spreadsheet. While you're at it, check out Andrewism's video on why we need a library economy. Andrewism is the best at solarpunk, what can I say? What other actions can help bring about a solarpunk future? Let me know in the comments. In conclusion, we have a world to win. It's important to be aware of what we have to lose. That can spur action. But it's also important to be aware of what we have to gain. A stick and a carrot. All my sources are in the video description. Thank you for watching, and with love and rage, goodbye.